Welcome to Dust History. Paris, 1793. The air is thick with smoke and blood. Not symbolic blood, but real, hot, human blood, splattering cobblestones, dripping from the blade of a new machine. The guillotine. It was meant to be humane, the great equalizer between king and beggar. Instead, it became a monster, devouring nobles, priests, revolutionaries, even children. What began as liberty descended into paranoia, mass executions, and rivers of crimson. This is not the story of freedom's birth, but of how an entire nation feasted on death. From the very beginning, execution was not merely a tool of justice. It was spectacle, a grotesque carnival where the masses gathered, jeering and gasping, to watch the old world die one severed head at a time. The revolution promised equality, fraternity, liberty, but it delivered those promises with a blade that fell cold and impartial on both tyrant and commoner alike. The guillotine, that infamous machine of modern efficiency, would come to symbolize the revolution. But before its steel edge became the great equalizer, Paris had known far darker, slower, and more brutal methods of death. The revolution did not invent cruelty. It inherited it from centuries of monarchy and sharpened it, paraded it, and perfected it for mass consumption. Picture, for a moment, a body stretched across the breaking wheel, limbs shattered by a heavy iron bar, bones splintering with dull cracks as the condemned screamed into the summer air. This was an old regime punishment, medieval in design, yet the revolutionaries, in their early fury, sometimes resurrected such ancient horrors. Or imagine the gallows, the noose swaying in the open square as a crowd surged forward, eager to watch breath fade from the eyes of another enemy of the people. The streets themselves became accomplices, torches reflected in pools of gore, boots slipped on crim, sun-slick stones. Children pressed forward on their tiptoes, craning their necks to see the death of dukes, priests, and sometimes neighbors. Paris had become a stage where morality was inverted. The act of killing was not hidden, but celebrated. The cries of the condemned were not hushed, but amplified by the roar of approval from the mob. And presiding over this theater was the promise of equality. In the words of Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotin, the machine that would bear his name was intended to be humane, a quick, painless death for noble and commoner alike. Gone would be the cruelty of prolonged suffering, the grotesque displays of mangled limbs and charred bodies. In its place, a single stroke, clean, mechanical, democratic. But what Dr. Guillotin could not have foreseen was how swiftly this humane invention would become a monster of its own. The guillotine was never just a machine, it was an altar. And Paris, in those fevered years, was transformed into a city of ritual sacrifice. Heads did not fall in silence. They fell to cheers, to drums, to chants of Vive la République. The scaffold became the revolution's most eloquent orator, and its voice was steel on flesh. In the early days, when King Louis XVI still sat on his throne, executions carried a different flavor. They were punishments meant to terrify, to remind the masses of their inferiority. Torture was not hidden but showcased, an act of dominance by a monarchy clinging to power. The revolution inverted this spectacle, but it did not erase it. Instead of kings displaying cruelty, it was now the people. Instead of fear, there was hunger, hunger to see justice done or vengeance enacted. And so Paris became accustomed to death, too accustomed. In the words of one horrified foreign visitor, "They kill here as easily as they cut their bread." The scaffold was no longer a place of solemn reckoning, it was a place of entertainment. Women brought their knitting, men drank and laughed, and vendors sold roasted chestnuts while heads tumbled into baskets. This was not justice, this was addiction. The French Revolution was supposed to be about ideals, liberty, equality, fraternity. But as the crowd screamed for more blood, as each execution fueled the demand for another, one truth became unavoidable. The revolution had unleashed something older, darker, and far more primal. It had awakened mankind's appetite for the spectacle of suffering. And this appetite would only grow. The year was 1792, and the revolution's fever reached a boiling point. The monarchy was crumbling, the streets throbbed with unrest, and Paris smelled of sweat, smoke, and impending doom. In this chaos, A new execution device rolled forward like some cold prophet of modernity, the guillotine. It was not the first time France had executed its enemies, but it was the first time death was industrialized. No more axes wielded by trembling hands. No more botched hangings that left victims writhing in agony. No more drawn-out torture across wheels and pyres. The guillotine was precise, impartial, and devastatingly efficient. A drop of the blade, a severed head, a stunned silence, then thunderous applause. The National Assembly decreed its use as a sign of progress. In their minds, death should not discriminate. No noble should enjoy a cleaner end than a common thief. Thus, the guillotine was hailed as the great equalizer. A noble duke and a starving peasant would both meet the same steel kiss. Equality, it seemed, extended to the grave. But what began as a symbol of fairness quickly warped into something monstrous. Consider the execution of King Louis XVI in January 1793. The king, stripped of crown and dignity, was led through a sea of jeering citizens to the scaffold at Place de la Révolution. The drums beat, drowning his final words. The blade fell, severing centuries of monarchy in one stroke. The crowd erupted in savage ecstasy. Some rushed forward to dip their handkerchiefs in royal blood as though touching relics of a fallen god. It was a turning point. If a king could be decapitated like a common criminal, then no one was safe. The guillotine had declared war not just on tyrants, but on hierarchy itself. And the people, intoxicated by this newfound power, demanded more. The scaffold became a daily ritual. Each morning, prisoners were carted through the Seine, treats and tumbrils, wooden carts creaking under the weight of the condemned. Faces pale, hair disheveled, eyes darting toward the horizon they would never see again. Some prayed, some cursed, some sat in silent resignation. Children ran alongside the carts, chanting and mocking as though escorting actors to a stage. When the guillotine blade fell, it fell not only on flesh, but on identity. Aristocrats, priests, generals, suspected counter-revolutionaries. The machine did not discriminate. Its blade gleamed in sunlight, wet with blood, lowering itself into history as the revolution's most enduring symbol. But efficiency came at a cost. What was once shocking grew mundane. Heads fell so frequently that the spectacle blurred into routine. The people of Paris, starved of bread yet glutted with blood, became addicted to the rhythm of the guillotine. Vendors set up stalls near the scaffold, selling wine, pastries, and souvenirs. Knitters, known as tricoteuses, sat calmly by, their needles clicking in time with each execution, weaving scarves as heads tumbled into sawdust. It was theater, but theater without end, and like all theater, it demanded escalation. As the revolution grew more paranoid, accusations of treason multiplied. To question the government, to whisper doubt, even to remain silent could be construed as counter-revolutionary. The guillotine no longer punished only the guilty. It devoured anyone marked as inconvenient. By 1793, the Reign of Terror was fully underway. Maximilien Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety justified the bloodshed as necessary purification. Terror is nothing but prompt, severe, inflexible justice, Robespierre declared. To him, the guillotine was not murder, but medicine, a cure for the disease of tyranny. Yet the cure proved more deadly than the disease. Executions multiplied by the hundreds. The blade fell in Paris, in Lyon, in Nantes, spreading like a plague of iron. In some cities, bodies piled faster than graves could be dug. In Nantes, entire boatloads of prisoners were chained and drowned in the Loire River, a grotesque alternative when the guillotine could not keep pace. And still, the crowds gathered. They came not only for vengeance, but for entertainment. Witnesses describe women laughing as heads rolled, men jostling for better views, children playing with bloodied straw. The guillotine had become more than a machine. It was a spectacle of belonging. To cheer at the scaffold was to affirm one's loyalty to the revolution. To flinch was to risk suspicion. The line between justice and bloodlust dissolved. The revolution had promised to uplift the people, but instead it enslaved them to a cycle of death. Liberty had birthed a machine that consumed without pause. The guillotine had been designed to civilize execution, to bring reason to death. Instead, it mechanized horror. And Paris, once the city of light, became a city of shadows, where every dawn promised another parade of the condemned. and the blade was only just beginning to thirst. By the summer of 1793, Paris had transformed into a city where the heartbeat of daily life was measured in executions. The Reign of Terror, as it would come to be known, was not merely a policy. It was a living nightmare, a relentless machine of suspicion, accusation, and death. The guillotine, standing tall at Place de la Révolution, became the focal point of the city's dread. Its wooden frame loomed like a skeletal tower, the blade glinting with cruel promise. Each day the tumbrils rattled through the streets, carrying their cargo of the condemned. Priests in tattered robes, nobles clutching rosaries, farmers, bakers, even children barely in their teens. None were exempt. The justification was always the same. The Republic must be purified. Enemies lurked everywhere, in every shadow, in every whisper. Robespierre and his Committee of Public Safety declared that terror was not only justified, but necessary. The blade was the revolution's sword of virtue, and the people, whipped into a frenzy of paranoia, obeyed. The trials were farces, grotesque parodies of justice. Accusations were vague, evidence scarce, verdicts predetermined. A neighbor's word, a careless remark, even silence itself, could condemn a person to death. The courtroom became nothing more than a prelude to the scaffold. Imagine the scene. The accused dragged before the revolutionary tribunal, sweat dripping down their faces as they tried to defend themselves. A slip of the tongue, a word uttered out of fear, and the judges would sneer. The jury rarely deliberated longer than minutes. A guilty verdict was almost guaranteed, for in the age of terror, innocence was treason. And so, they were led to the guillotine. The condemned climbed the scaffold stairs, each creak of the wood echoing their doom. The executioner seized them, bound their hands, and pushed their necks beneath the lunette. The blood. He fell with its sickening hiss. A head tumbled into the wicker basket. The crowd roared, and the executioner held it aloft for all to see. Blood ran in rivulets across the platform, dripping into the sawdust below, mingling with the gore of countless others. But this was not enough. The revolution's appetite grew insatiable. Entire groups were marched to their deaths. The Girondins, once allies of the Jacobins, were dragged en masse to the guillotine. Their crime? Political disagreement. The blade cut down one after another, their heads rolling like dominoes of flesh and bone. The queen herself, Marie Antoinette, was paraded through the streets, jeered at by the mob she once ignored. Her powdered wigs and jewels were gone. She appeared haggard, her hair cut short, her gown plain. When the blade severed her head, the roar of triumph from the crowd was deafening. But behind the cheers, there was something darker, a hunger not satisfied, but inflamed. Paris became a carnival of cruelty. Witnesses describe women knitting steadily as dozens of heads rolled before them, their hands never pausing, their faces serene. Vendors sold pamphlets and caricatures mocking the condemned. One man even kept a blood-stained handkerchief from Charlotte Corday, the young woman who assassinated Marat, as a morbid keepsake. The terror was not limited to Paris. In Lyon, thousands were massacred with grape shot, their bodies left rotting in the streets. In Nantes, prisoners were loaded onto barges and drowned in the Loire, men, women, even children. The river swelled with corpses, earning the grim name La Baignoire Nationale, the national bathtub. The revolution had promised liberty, but what it delivered was an orgy of death. It was as though the nation itself had become possessed, its pulse quickening with each execution, its veins flooded with blood. And yet, beneath the triumphant spectacle, fear gnawed at everyone, for no one was safe. Today, you could be a proud revolutionary cheering at the scaffold. Tomorrow, you might be the one climbing its stairs. The same blade that had executed kings now awaited the common man. The guillotine was loyal to no one. The irony was bitter. Those who unleashed the terror would themselves fall victim to it. Danton, once the thunderous voice of revolution, was dragged to the scaffold with his allies. He laughed bitterly as the blade descended, his last words mocking the executioner, "Show my head to the people. It's worth the trouble." But perhaps the most chilling figure was Robespierre himself, the man who had sanctified terror. He believed he wielded the guillotine in the name of virtue, that each execution was a step toward utopia. Yet paranoia consumed him too. His voice grew shrill, his eyes haunted, his speeches filled with venom, and when the tide turned against him, the very machine he exalted awaited him. The Reign of Terror was not merely a political purge. It was a descent into collective madness, a chapter of history where justice was drowned in blood and fear ruled every waking hour. And still, the blade fell, day after day, carving its tally into the flesh of a nation. By 1794, the revolution had become a serpent eating its own tail. What had begun as a purge of aristocrats and monarchists was now consuming revolutionaries themselves. The blade that once symbolized liberation had become a judge without mercy, striking down anyone who dared to breathe in a way that seemed suspicious. And at the center of this maelstrom stood Maximilien Robespierre, pale, severe, and increasingly haunted by the machinery he had set in motion. To his followers, he was the incorruptible, a man who lived with Spartan simplicity, driven only by his devotion to virtue. But to his enemies, and even to many allies, he had become a fanatic, a zealot, who cloaked tyranny in the language of purity. Robespierre believed terror was a sacred duty. He declared that virtue without terror was powerless, and terror without virtue was fatal. To him, the guillotine was the scalpel of revolution, carving away corruption and betrayal. Yet every cut only deepened the wound, and soon the body of France was bleeding out beneath his hands. The list of victims grew grotesquely long. Nobles and priests had been the first to fall, but soon it was Jacobins, Girondins, Hébertistes, Dantonists, factions within factions, each accused of treachery, each dragged to the scaffold. The revolution had no mercy for hesitation, no patience for dissent. One day's hero became the next day's traitor. Picture the scene in the tribunal. Danton, once the roaring lion of the revolution, stood before the judges, his powerful voice defiant even in chains. He mocked the trial, knowing his fate was already sealed. When he mounted the scaffold, he spat his final challenge. "You will show my head to the people. It is worth the trouble." Moments later, his words were silenced by the hiss of steel. So it went, again and again, the revolution devouring its own children. But something was changing. Beneath the cheers of the crowd, whispers of unease grew louder. The executions were no longer extraordinary. They were endless. The spectacle was losing its thrill, and horror was settling in. Ordinary Parisians began to dread the sound of tumbrils rolling past their windows. Any careless word, any neighbor's suspicion, could bring them to the scaffold. What had once been celebrated as justice now felt like a curse. The summer of 1794 brought the terror to its climax. Robespierre, rigid and self-righteous, began speaking less of enemies and more of conspiracies, as though shadows lurked behind every curtain. His speeches grew longer, more venomous and more vague. He hinted at traitors even within the convention, terrifying allies who feared they might be next on his invisible list. The guillotine had become a god to Robespierre, and he its high priest. But priests who demand too many sacrifices are eventually silenced. On July 27, 1794, the 9th of Thermidor by the revolutionary calendar, the tide turned. In the convention, Robespierre rose to speak, his voice quivering with fury, but his enemies drowned him out. He was shouted down, his authority crumbling before his eyes. Once feared as the voice of justice, he now looked like a cornered man. That night, chaos gripped Paris. Robespierre and his allies barricaded themselves in the Hôtel de Ville, plotting resistance. Outside, the convention declared them outlaws. At dawn, soldiers stormed the building. Gunfire erupted. Robespierre was found slumped in a chair, his jaw shattered by a pistol shot. Whether by his own hand or another's remains debated. Dragged, broken, and bleeding, he was taken not to safety, but to the very machine he had worshipped. On July 28th, Robespierre and 21 of his closest allies were paraded through the streets in tumbrils. The crowd, once obedient to his words, now jeered and spat. His jaw was bound with a dirty rag to keep it from dangling grotesquely. When his turn came, the executioner tore the bandage away, and Robespierre's scream, half human, half animal, was drowned by the roar of the mob. The blade fell, and with it the terror collapsed. The crowd cheered, but the sound was different this time, not the frenzy of triumph, but the relief of survivors. The spell of the guillotine was broken. For 5 years, France had gorged on blood. Now, the people were sick of the taste. Yet the machine did not disappear. It remained, looming in the shadows of Paris, a silent reminder of how quickly liberty can become tyranny, how ideals can be twisted into instruments of death. The revolution had begun with dreams of light. It ended in rivers of blood. And though the blade was sheathed, its shadow stretched far into the future, a warning carved in steel. The blade was silent now, its frame dismantled from the square, but its ghost lingered. Paris, once intoxicated by the spectacle of death, woke from its fever with blood still staining the cobblestones. The revolution had ended the monarchy, destroyed the old order, and promised rebirth. Yet the memory that endured most vividly was not liberty or fraternity. It was the relentless fall of the guillotine. The numbers alone were staggering. In less than a year of the terror, tens of thousands were executed, imprisoned, or massacred. Paris saw hundreds of heads roll in public squares. Provinces like Lyon and Nantes drowned in their own rivers of blood. Even after Robespierre's fall, the guillotine continued its work, though with less frenzy, until Napoleon rose to power and eventually carried France into new wars. But what remained was not only the physical tally of the dead, it was the psychological scar. The revolution had shown the world how quickly ideals could be drowned in cruelty, how the machinery of justice could become a machinery of terror. The guillotine was supposed to be humane, a symbol of reason triumphing over barbarism. Instead, it became the very image of barbarism cloaked in reason. For decades afterward, Parisians could not pass through Place de la Révolution, later renamed Place de la Concorde, without remembering the roar of the mob, the thud of tumbrils, the hiss of steel. The square became a haunted place, not of kings or queens, but of thousands of anonymous souls sacrificed to an idea. The irony is almost unbearable. The revolution declared that all men were equal, and in the guillotine, equality was indeed achieved. In death, the nobleman and the beggar, the priest and the atheist, the monarch and the peasant, all reduced to silence beneath the same blade, the equality of the grave. Yet even as the revolution ended, the guillotine lived on. It was not a relic to be buried, but a tool the French state continued to use for more than a century and a half. Executions by guillotine persisted until 1977, when Hamida Jandoubi, a Tunisian immigrant convicted of murder, was decapitated in Marseille. And only in 1981, when France abolished the death penalty, did the guillotine's reign finally end. Nearly 200 years after Dr. Guillotin proposed it as a humane alternative, the machine was still claiming lives. This longevity carved the guillotine into the very psyche of France. It became a symbol of the revolution in art, literature, and memory. Writers painted it as a monster of iron, a specter that hovered over every political upheaval. Even today, when people speak of revolutions, the image of the guillotine looms, sharp, mechanical, inevitable. But perhaps the darkest legacy lies not in the machine itself, but in what it revealed about humanity. The revolution proved that cruelty does not require sadism. It does not need torture racks or burning pyres. It can hide behind the mask of efficiency, cloaked in the rhetoric of equality. A blade that falls in an instant can still become the centerpiece of horror when multiplied by thousands. It also revealed the fragility of morality under pressure. Ordinary men and women who might have lived quiet, uneventful lives found themselves cheering as heads rolled, knitting calmly beside the scaffold, or dipping their handkerchiefs in human blood. It was not monsters who sustained the terror, but the crowd, neighbors, friends, citizens. The French Revolution sought to erase tyranny, yet it birthed a new form of it. Tyranny by fear, tyranny by blade. The very ideals that promised to free mankind instead shackled it to violence, proving how thin the line is between justice and vengeance, between virtue and fanaticism. And so, the guillotine remains not only a relic of steel, but a warning carved into history. It whispers that revolutions, however noble in intent, can become hungry gods demanding sacrifice, that the pursuit of purity can curdle into paranoia, that when a society feasts too long on blood, it begins to lose its soul. Today, when we stand in the quiet square of Place de la Concorde, the traffic rushing past and tourists snapping photos, it is difficult to imagine the roar of thousands, the thud of bodies, the river of crimson staining the earth. But beneath the stones, the echoes remain. The ghosts of kings, queens, revolutionaries, and nameless citizens whisper in unison, their voices rising from the silence of 2 centuries. Their message is chilling, eternal, and simple. Beware the blade that falls in the name of justice, for justice can rot into terror, and liberty can choke on blood.